Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Rich Longo, and I'll be your host. And I want to thank you for joining us for another Flycast Partners webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day for us. Today's webinar is things you should know before interpreting the yearly analyst reports for ITSM tools, presented by Jarod Greene. Jarod is the Vice President of Product Marketing at Cherwell Software. Prior to joining Cherwell, he was a Research Director and Principal Research Analyst at Gartner. He worked for Gartner for over 12 years and was involved in the development of the Gartner Magic Quadrant, and Jarod has played a key role in evaluating all the major ITSM tools within the industry and his first knowledge of their strengths and weaknesses through his research. Today, he will share how this information is formulated and how we should interpret it. But before we get started, Jarod, let me introduce our organization, Flycast Partners. Flycast Partners is here to deliver a seriously amazing IT experience. Founded and staffed by personnel that have many years of experience in the IT space, we took the best ideas from these collective experiences and added the best components necessary to grow and become a leading value-added reseller in the North American IT market. We offer best-in-class implementation services and training in ITSM, ITAM, and workload automation spaces using nothing but ITIL best practices. Our professional services can easily scale up or down in order to meet the IT needs of any customer regardless of size, complexity, or budgetary restrictions. We offer implementation services both on-site and remote, as well as training to reinforce your organization's long-term IT success. Our ongoing administration and support service offerings will enable your organization to focus on your normal day-to-day operations, saving you both time and money. Please visit us at www.flycastpartners.com or feel free to call us at 844-FLYCAST. That's 844-359-2278. This is just one of our many weekly webinars, and we encourage you to utilize our website for researching those webinars and signing up, researching industry white papers, training that is available from ITIL to ITSM tools, assistance with professional services, and our new ITSM Solution Finder. Now, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn this presentation over to our guest speaker today, Jarod Greene. Jarod, welcome, and thank you for taking time out of your day to present this for us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks, Rich, for having me, and thanks for everyone attending the webinar. It's fun to be here, and it's fun to be here to talk about this topic that's near and dear to my heart, not just because of my role at Cherwell, but because at the core, I'm still an analyst, right? I still look at the space. I still understand the competitive landscape. And being now on the other side of the equation, right, as the vendor being analyzed by the analyst, has been an interesting exercise, to say the least. So what I want to do more than anything is just talk about not so much that experience, but what I've been able to learn in that experience, right, having been the analyst, now having been the vendor, understanding what messages need to be conveyed to customers or prospects who are looking at what analysts create. So essentially, this could have been called, you know, the demystifying the magic of the Magic Quadrant, or you know, riding the Forrester wave, or understanding IDC's market scope. But essentially, we know that customers and prospects, Rich, you talked about the ITSM finder that Flycast had. We know that looking at solutions is a daunting task. We know it's not easy. And ultimately, these annual ITSM analyst reports work to save you a lot of time in saying, here are the vendors in the space that have a certain revenue criteria. Here's the vendors in the space that meet a defined set of needs. But once you get past the picture, right, once you get past the visual, what are some of the next steps? And I think that's where the real work comes in, of really understanding how that picture was put together. So if nothing else, we can talk a little bit about how the report's created, and then I can provide some best practices in how to interpret it that are non-vendor specific, even coming from the VP of Product Marketing at Cherwell. So if that sounds good, I'll go ahead and proceed. So again, I briefly mentioned the fact that the technology selection can be daunting. I mean, I think if you were counting the number of tools that are either ITIL-based or can work in a help desk from a ticketing or a workflow perspective across the globe, you could very easily run into 400 different tools. When I was at Gartner, we had a count of about 425. There was a crowdsourced list from Listly that was popular a few years ago. There are many tools in this space. And when you look at what differentiates them, I think at one point in time, ITIL or ITIL Pink Verification or Pink Verified Solutions worked as a differentiator, but I think what that's done is it's created solutions that all align to the framework out of the box, and that became less of a differentiator. So most of the tools are ITIL aligned, whether they're Pink Verified or not. So that kind of negates the need to differentiate with that header. You now see different licensing models. I think there was a period in time where the software as a service model was unique. There were only a few companies who were able to either start in that model, right? It presented low barriers to entry in the beginning, right? If I could put my solution and host that and really build it to stretch or build it with the elasticity in mind and get that to market first, that was great, but that was almost 10 years ago. So we're at a space now where virtually every vendor you run into has an on-premise product by default, but may not have, or excuse me, I say it the other way around. They all have some form of SaaS capability, right? The ability to deliver the product in a place that's not yours, right, on someone else's computer. So now you see different licensing models. You're starting to see consumption-based licensing. You're starting to see the ability to switch licensing at any point. So, you know, standing up and saying I want an idle-based SaaS solution isn't going to, you know, give you 3 results. It's going to give you probably 30, if not more. So again, these are less of the differentiators that they once were. And I think with the perception that the market's commoditized, you start to see aggressive discounting. So, you know, you can find tools at the high end of the range. You can find $1 million tools. You can find tools that'll work for a couple bucks a month, honestly, per user, that you can swipe with the credit card. So the aggressive level of discounting, or should I say just sort of the wide price ranges, it can be difficult to find a tool. So again, once you gather requirements, once you finalize those requirements, and once you bring those to market, you still got a lot of different things to choose from. And so now you're thinking about different pricing and packaging considerations. The work really just begins, you know, once you start to look at these tools to help you narrow the scope. And that's really the question, right? When you look at these industry analyst reports, and I've chosen Forrester, Gartner, and IDC for a minute, when you look at those industry reports, you know, do they come to your rescue, right? Because again, the IT leaders who look to these firms for assistance, you know, do so, I think, a lot of times to save time. So I can look at 400 solutions, or I can look at a Magic Quadrant and see the top 10 or 15. I can look at 30 solutions, or I can look at the Forrester Wave to see from a SaaS perspective what makes the most sense. And even from a financial perspective, if I want to get a sense of who's gaining share of the market, right? Who's innovating, who's doing things that are different to help grow revenue, the IDC report can be very effective for those purposes, which may give us a nod to how the vendor's going to spend those funds on research and development to continue to build the top of products. And so I think you look at these reports collectively, sometimes they tell a similar story, and that's the case with this last round of research. You're looking at the 2015 Gartner Quadrant there in the middle that has BMC and ServiceNow as leaders. When you look at the IDC market scope, you see the same thing, BMC and ServiceNow as leaders, with Cherwell as a challenger or a major player that's on the line. And you can also see the same from a different perspective from the Forrester Wave. The Forrester Wave looked at SaaS capabilities or SaaS delivery capabilities, to which you know, BMC's Remedy Force product was evaluated. And so again, they're not in the same leader bubble, but you can certainly see that the reports do look similar as far as the players in the space and where they stand, with only slight variation once you change the model. So do these reports come to the rescue? I think they do save some time for some IT leaders, but there's still work to do once you look at how these dots on the grid shake out. And so I think the one myth that I'd like to dispel is that contrary to popular belief, where the vendors get placed in these analyses has no correlation with the amount of money that's spent with those firms. I can stand up and tell you that as a former analyst in the space, that the research advisory firms that you see here operate with the highest levels of integrity at every turn, and in the minute that's called into question, they cease to exist. They take their reputation extremely seriously, and I think it's important to take that into consideration as you look at the reports. You've probably seen and read a lot of, the pay-for-play notions. Those just aren't real. I think there is the conversation of the money you spend with these firms provides you the ability to talk to the analyst at a more frequent clip. And in talking to the analyst, you get a sense of the direction of the market, you get a sense of the messaging, and the closer you align to that or demonstrate your product's ability to align that, there's certainly an advantage. But to say that there's a direct correlation between the amount of money spent and where the vendor's place is certainly not the case. So again, if the takeaway here is that there's still work to do once we look at these reports, the choice is still yours to make. Because what I don't think these reports do a great job of doing is helping you understand your unique requirements. So you might begin with the research notes, and they may do a great job of narrowing the field from 400 down to 10, but in terms of being able to fully understand what is going to work for you as a unique organization, as an organization that has a unique set of requirements that those reports don't take into consideration. If you consider every business to be different, with a different message, with a different level of competitive advantage or ability to sustain it, and every business is different, then your requirements are going to be different. So none of the reports work to give you that apples-to-apples comparison of, will my experience as a manufacturing company in the Midwest with 2,000 employees, how is that going to marry up against an institution of higher learning on the West Coast that's supporting 100,000 students, faculty, administration, and multiple sort of assets to manage? Those two experiences may be dramatically different depending on the requirements that they bring forth to the table. So what do you have to consider when you come to the table? You need to understand your budget. Well, how much are you going to spend on this tool? You need to understand your IT maturity level from a process, from a people perspective. How ready are we to adopt the ITIL best practices that come out of the box? Are we further along than we, understand? Are we further behind than we understand? Those things matter. Those things are going to play in the role. Those things are going to play a role in the return you get on your investment here. What's your integration approach? Do you have IT management solutions in the portfolio that you'd like to integrate with these ITSM solutions? Or do you plan on working with a vendor who provides all of the solutions to give you, one hand to shake or one neck to choke, depending on how you feel? What's the integration approach, and how do these vendors answer challenge of integration? Do they do it with APIs? Do they do it with professional services? Is everything ad hoc? You don't get a sense of these questions when you look at that report. And even when you read those reports, these questions aren't always as easily answered as you'd like them to be. What's the total cost of ownership going to be? I understand what it's going to get to license the tool. I understand what it's going to mean to get it up and running. But day in, day out, month in, month out, year over year, what's the total cost? What's the real total cost of ownership going to be from a maintenance and administration standpoint? Quadrant, Wave, Market Scope can't answer that question. What's the culture alignment? Right? When you get a sense of how you're going to do business with the vendor, do they have the same norms and values as you? You might not think that matters, but what about the relationship? I think it goes a long way, when a vendor takes an interest in your success as opposed to just taking an interest in your check. And there is a substantial difference in the way vendors approach that, believe it or not. What about the vertical understanding? What about the roadmap? So I'm throwing these questions out to say that the quadrants are a great start, but then once you start to evaluate these vendors, these are the questions you ask in the room. These are the questions that you might even, when you narrow down your final 4, your final 5, or 3 if you're 2, these are the questions you ask. These are the things that ultimately make a difference in whether or not you choose to do business with vendor A or vendor B. So the choice is still yours to make even after you consume those industry analyst reports. Here's what I want to highlight. You review the industry reports. Now what? Now what are you going to do? Right? The research provides, I think, a very effective launch point for you to begin your selection process, but you still have a significant amount of work and due diligence to truly understand the vendor differences as they relate to your unique and specific requirements. So here's some questions you might want to ask yourself, or here's the things you want to think about. You need to seek answers to these 4 questions when you read the annual ITSM reports. Who's the report for? What's the report cover? When and how did the evaluation take place? And do the standards of the analyst align with the standards that we bring to the table? Because, again, to assume that the analyst understands your unique perspective as an organization would be a false assumption. So here's the first question. Who's the report for? And it sounds simple, right? It sounds simple to say, well, the reports are for the industry. That's not the case, right? Many organizations will consume the industry research. So from that perspective, it's for the industry. But you have to remember that the reports are for the sole intended use of the firm's customers and not all clients of the firm, right? So when you think about it from that perspective, let's think about Gartner for a minute. Roughly 74% of Gartner's customers are Fortune 1000s, and about 75% of the base are Fortune, Global 500. They use Gartner to support their key decisions with Gartner advice. And Gartner's connections and Gartner's relationships and Gartner's inquiry and access with those organizations helps them produce insights that benefit their clients. So with that said, when you think from a Gartner perspective, when they do the research, the evidence that they use usually comes from larger, more complex organizations. Now, it's not to say that that's an exclusive conversation. Gartner talks to organizations of all shapes and sizes who can afford the research seat, who can afford the inquiry seat to have that discussion, right? But that also includes the product demonstration, the survey, the customer references. Those are the things Gartner uses to make the evaluation, but it's mostly based on the interactions that they have with customers throughout the year. So as such, I've found now on the outside that yes, the Gartner message is skewed or lean more towards the larger, more complex organizations who typically are doing business with larger, more complex IT management solutions. And so Gartner does have to cater to that base in the message because that becomes the fact base. So there is an element of an echo chamber. It's not to be negative. It's not to dismiss the wonderful things Gartner does. But I do think when the response from Gartner a lot is, well, this is what our customers say and this is what our customers tell us, you have to remember that that is the fact base they use. If you're not one of those customers or if you're not one of those organizations, a lot of times the output is not catered or synthesized or contextualized to meet your needs. And again, it's very difficult for an analyst to understand every single industry vertical challenge. It's very difficult for an analyst to understand every specific budget challenge or culture challenge within an organization. So again, effective launch point, but at the end of the day, Gartner writes research for Gartner customers. Forrester writes research for Forrester customers. IDC writes research for IDC customers. The way you get your hands on that research may vary, but ultimately when it's put together, it is put together with the thought and the intentions and the goals of retaining and renewing services from their respective customer bases. Here's the next question to consider. What's the report cover? And what I mean by that is that the misconception a lot with a Quadrant or a Wave or a market scope or any vendor analysis or any is that it's a product analysis. And that's not the case, right? Gartner isn't doing, or Forrester isn't doing product-specific analysis a lot. They're doing vendor analysis. It's the vendor's ability to build and develop and drive and market a product in the respective space. So a lot of times, the conversation used to be around, why do you see vendor X, continue to be a leader in this space despite challenges that they've had? Well, their ability to lead or their ability to execute or their ability to innovate is there because they're a large vendor. But a lot of times they don't take those opportunities to lead, to drive, to innovate. And so again, these are vendor-focused evaluations, not necessarily product ones. And I think a big misconception is that there is a lab, a consumer reports-oriented lab where the analysts touch the product, they evaluate the product, they stress test the product. Not the case with any analyst firm I've seen to date. And so, again, there's a discussion out there on whether or not the crowd can be a better judge of how the products will work in an environment. And I think there's merit to that discussion, but there need to be standards, which I think the analysts do a better job of applying. And so I say that to say this: a vendor might offer multiple products in a space, and it can be very difficult to ascertain in a research report what products are they talking about. I see a .4 vendor, but that vendor has 3 service management products. Which one is it? I think the vendors like that because they can say it's whatever one you're going to buy, but oftentimes that's not the case. So when organizations, even when they issue an RFP to a vendor, oftentimes the vendor determines what solution in the portfolio will be a best fit, as opposed to understanding your technical requirements as an organization. So yeah, think about that, right? The reports are focused on the vendor's ability to execute, the vendor's ability to gather market share, the vendor's ability to drive innovation, that don't always make it into the product. And so you're going to ultimately use the product that's built by a vendor that you establish a relationship with, but I wouldn't take any position of a vendor as an indication of the best product. This isn't Consumer Reports, right? This is the vendor evaluation. Here's the third question I want you to ask after you read it: when and how does evaluation take place? This is interesting because I think what you see a lot in this space is that for every single firm I've worked with, again to date, has a cutoff date for evaluation. So what that means is that you may be looking at a report that was written 6 months after a new version of the product was released. You may be looking at a report that doesn't take into consideration things that the vendors have already addressed. So because there's a cutoff date, and the cutoff date usually states that a product has to be in general availability by a certain time period, it's important to do because it makes sure that vendors don't get credit for products that haven't been released. But again, in the same example I used, if a report is published 6 months after the cutoff date, new functions, new features, new capabilities may be available in the product that aren't going to show up in the report. And the likelihood that report, or not the likelihood, the report lives for about a year. So there could be a situation where you're looking at a report that is 17 months out of date, and the vendor's gone about addressing every single challenge that's been noted, every single caution that's been noted, everything's been fixed and buttoned up and addressed, particularly as you start to see SaaS-based vendors start to issue faster release cycles. So you're no longer waiting on version X to solve your headaches for a year and a half. You're starting to see vendors move to more agile development cycles where they're getting new features, functions, capabilities, perform enhancements out the door once every quarter. So again, you have to understand that drift. And as far as understanding how the evaluation takes place, it's important to get a sense of what level of customer feedback was provided, what percentage of customer feedback was taken into consideration. But when you talk to customers, were they people who, have a financial incentive to be references? Did you talk to the same people on a frequent basis? That's often the case with a lot of the evaluations. So think about it: what customers were spoken to, what size of those customers, what region of the world are those customers in? A lot of times, if the requirement is we need a global instance of our solution, was the analyst speaking with the majority of global customers or local? And that example can work both ways. So think about it. Think about how the evaluation took place, when did it take place, what the cutoff date is. Understand that research lives on. Rich and I were talking earlier, a lot of times things get said, they exist on the record, but it may not actually be the case. And you as a buyer, you as a prospect, will have a more up-to-date understanding of a product than an analyst report will, because oftentimes as soon as it publishes, it can be months out of date. And then the fourth and final point is, do the analyst standards align with yours as a buyer? I think a lot of times when you look at industry research, it's prioritized and weighted on criteria that may not align with your requirements. So if you think about the Gartner report for a minute, what if one of your key requirements as a buyer was the ability to use a service management tool outside of IT? I want it to do workflow for HR, facilities, and other lines of businesses. Then would you be surprised to know that Gartner did not evaluate any of the tools' ability to do that in this last Magic Quadrant, right? Have the firms evaluated those capabilities? If they have not, there's no measure of how customers or how vendors enable their customers to do those things. And also you want to think about, is there weight provided for vertical alignment for a vertical industry you're not in? So might a firm say, we get a lot of calls from higher ed organizations, so 20% is going to be based on higher ed feedback. If you're not a higher ed, is that of extreme value to you? Maybe not. And also another instance is that you may see more weight applied to things like the ability to integrate with a wider range of IT operations management tools that come from the same vendor. Again, if it's not a requirement of yours, where the dot or where the bubble ends up may not affect you. So again, I think it's important to understand your unique requirements, what your organization seeks from an ITSM tool, understand if the analyst requirements align to those, and if so, get an understanding of where you're similar. If not, you may be looking at a report that doesn't speak to you or reflect your unique set of needs. So here are the other things that you have to consider from a wider range of variables perspective that, again, you can't get from a snapshot or can't get from the full report. How easy is it going to be to do business with the vendor, right? Can you manage and maintain a quality relationship? And that's beyond technical support. Is the vendor driven by your success, right? Is the vendor going to partner with you to make sure that the investment you made in them will bear fruit? That's not the case for every single one of the 400 vendors in this market. And I'm not throwing shade for the sake of throwing shade. I'm telling you that's the case because it is. How flexible is the vendor's pricing model, right? Can you have a situation where if you want concurrent licenses, you can get those? If you want it on-premise or if you want it cloud-based, if you want to switch at any point in time, how flexible is the vendor going to be to work with you? And do they have customers that can validate that the experience is seamless? How easy is it to upgrade the products? Without question, you're going to buy a product that you say you won't customize and configure, that you ultimately have to customize and configure. And then when it comes to upgrade time, is there going to be a $30,000 assessment fee for you to determine the readiness of the upgrade on top of any services you need to repair what breaks when you do the upgrade? How well is the product performed from a SaaS perspective? I think I've talked about most vendors now start to align and build and license in the cloud, but does it scale to meet your needs? Are there latency issues? Are there availability issues? Scalability? Those are things you have to ask. Can the product be customized outside of IT if you have those requirements? Those are things you have to ask the vendor that are not evaluated in a lot of the industry analyst reports. And the last piece of it is how easy or expensive is it going to be to install, customize, configure, and integrate? Because, again, I think unless the analysts have a solid understanding of your IT management portfolio, your integration requirements, your ability to customize with your in-house resources with the level of training and staff and knowledge that they have, it's difficult for them to say vendor X is easy, vendor Y is hard. It's difficult because there's just too many variables on the table. So with that, I will draw to a close. I think we made it just on time, Rich. We can stop for any questions. But if anyone would like to learn more, whether it's from Flycast or from Cherwell directly, feel free to visit our websites, which are here listed for you. And at this point, Rich, I can answer any questions if the room has any.
Folks, if you have any questions for Jarod, this is the time for it. This is a very rare opportunity. He does not do this all the time. It's not something that he normally goes out there and presents, so we were very fortunate to have him today. So if you have questions about this process or anything about how to read these things, now's the time to ask. I do want to thank you, Jarod, for taking time out of your busy day to do this for us, and thank you for making us the first organization to be the recipient of this great presentation. We really do appreciate that. I want to thank everybody else who attended today for taking time out of your busy day. And it doesn't look like I have any questions showing up. If you do have a question, please email me at rich.longo@flycastpartners.com. That's rich.longo@flycastpartners.com. Or reach out and call us directly at 844-FLYCAST. That's 844-359-2278. We'll get you an answer to your question within 5 business days. We'll send it out to Jarod and see what kind of answer he can provide us. And with that being said, I'm going to thank you again today, Mr. Greene, for your time.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks, Rich, and thank you, everybody, for attending. Appreciate it.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks. Thank you.